Welcome to Chapter 17. This chapter we're going to look at harvesting. So 5 major aspects of harvesting that we're going to look at is drying of the crop, how we store it, so whether that's in a grain bin or whether that's with a co-op, however we're going to store it. We'll look at a lot of those different strategies and aspects. We're going to talk about harvesting forage and how that compares to harvesting other crops. So just a couple key concepts for you to know and understand. Harvest, for those of you who haven't really grown up on a farm, is just the completion of that crop. So after that, when we're at harvest, we're taking out that seed, we're taking out that grain, whatever we're trying to harvest or complete, that's what we're doing. So the whole goal is to sell at the correct time and sell at the correct price to maximize what we have. So we have to look at the maturity of the plant. We have to look at the accumulation of the grain matter that has occurred, the moisture levels, and in some cases, when you're looking at forages, we have to look at how we're going to store it. So are we going to bale it, or are we going to chop it to silage, and make some of those decisions, and unfortunately, sometimes pretty quick. Then we'll look at how crops have to have some sort of specialized harvest equipment. So if you have a combine, you have to have a corn head and then a soybean head. So different types of equipment and different types of ways to harvest crops. Now let's look at harvest. So again, this is just the completion of that crop, the production cycle. So we don't harvest, we don't harvest corn when it's green. We harvest corn when it is dead, essentially, and that moisture is almost all gone out of that seed. So once we're almost to harvest, then the whole marketing of that crop starts to come into a pretty big play. So some people will start to sell that crop right out of the field as they're harvesting. Some farmers will wait until after they're harvesting when they have it in a grain bin. Some farmers will sell months before they harvest. So that's when those decisions can be made. And then after that crop is then harvested, we have to figure out where we're going to store it. So if you're going to wait to sell it in September, so for example, if you just harvested wheat in June and the price is not good enough to meet your break even, you wait until September. Where are you going to store that? And is it going to cost money to store it? So we'll talk a little bit more of that in class this week as well. All right, so now grain crops. Let's talk about harvesting grain crops. So we have to look at the physiological maturity of the grain. So is that grain, is the moisture where it needs to be? Is the maturity level where it needs to be? Is it ready to be harvested? And so we have to measure that moisture. We have to measure where that maturity is in that stage, and unfortunately have to wait just until that crop is ready. So if we decide we're going to harvest on a Thursday and it rains Wednesday night, there's still going to be a little bit more moisture in there. So you kind of have to play around a little bit with your methods and management of how to get that crop out of the ground. So physiological maturity of grains, we have to, again, the whole point of the physiological maturity is just get that maximum dry matter out of that seed. So some examples of that is when, like in a soybean, that pod color change starts to happen, and so we know that maturity is almost done. That milk line in corn is done. You can see a dent in that corn, and it's dry or drier than in the milk stage. Sunflower heads turn a color. So those are when we know that dry matter seed is starting to dry up and it's almost time to harvest. So here's an example of what I mean by the physiological maturity. So this is between oat seed weight and then the moisture. Okay, so when we harvest oats, we're harvesting the oat seed, and we have to look at the moisture. So if you see that dotted line there, you can see the seed moisture compared to the seed dry weight. So we have to match where we want to harvest so that we're not going to have too much moisture, and that seed maturity, that seed dry weight is not going to be down, okay? Because farmers get paid on the weight in some cases. So we want to make sure that there's just enough weight, not too much, not too little. So how do we dry that grain before harvesting? First off, we have to make sure before we're harvesting that that grain is at that correct level of moisture. If not, if it's too high, microorganisms can get in there. One-celled organisms can get in there. So funguses, viruses. We have a big problem around here with aflatoxins, or a lot of different toxins, really. So, and that's mainly because people are harvesting it before it's too dry. So, or before that dryness is where it needs to be. So, when that maturity is intact, then the grains don't dry enough for the storage to be dried any further. So we have to, if we're going to move it from a combine to a crop, or a wagon to a grain bin, it's going to be drying every time it goes in and out of one of those pieces of equipment. So knowing that, we have to be very vigilant in how we're going to dry that seed before we take it to market. Obviously, air temperatures will help that, air flow, decreasing the humidity, which is always nice in the summertime in Oklahoma because it always seems to be very, very humid. So those are all those aspects that we really have to take into consideration before we. So once we have the correct moisture, once we have the correct maturity level, it's time to harvest. So when that happens, that moisture content is then combined with that grain, and it can be combined. So it's ready to be harvested. So we look here's just a couple moisture levels that we'll look at. A lot of people in different parts of the country, they will harvest corn at different moistures. Soybeans, though, however, it's anywhere from 12 to 15%. 13% is a good grain moisture for soybeans. Small grains, they can be swathed before harvest so that they'll dry a little bit quicker. So here's an example of a soybean field loss at several grain moistures. So you can see on the left-hand side, the soybeans lost pounds per acre. So we're talking pounds. We're not talking bushels, okay? Talking pounds. So, and then on the bottom there is the percent of moisture content. So as those pounds start to go down, then the moisture content starts to go down. Then we start to see some machine loss, then we start to see some shatter loss, and then we'll have another situation on our hands. All right, so methods of grain harvesting. So all of the grain that we harvest is harvested by a combine. So that combine might have a different grain head for different types of crops, but it's always usually with a combine, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. So that combine is cutting, it's gathering, it's threshing, and it's cleaning the grain all in one. So that big machine is doing all of that. So pretty neat to see in a field. So what do we do with the crop residue? So if we harvest wheat, we have wheat straw. What do we do with that? Some people bale it up, some people leave it on the ground to decompose into the ground for organic matter. So different management systems require different ways of doing things. And then that residue obviously can, like we talked about, be picked up for baling or be left on the ground for being decomposed into the ground. So here's what a combine looks like. If you look at the very left-hand part of this picture here, you'll see where it says a gathering head. So that's going to cut the grain. So if we're going to look at, let's say, corn, that corn head is going to cut that whole stalk, but then take that ear of corn off of the stalk. It's going to go through that head. It's going to go up where that cylinder concave is going to be. There's a fan that's going to start to dry them. There's that sieves that will start to separate the grain from the cob. Then it'll spit out that straw or any extras that are in there. Now, in some cases, there are some weeds that can't be, some weed seed that can't be pushed out because they're too small. But that shaking will then separate that grain, and then it will go into the grain hopper. So it's doing all of that in one one motion, really. So pretty cool. This is what it looks like when we're harvesting soybeans. So you can see the maturity level of those soybeans. Everything just looks dead there. The only thing that you could really see are those seed pods. So like I just showed you in the image before this slide, all of those seeds will get separated from the pods and be put into that hopper. Here is loading corn into a trailer. So you can see this this is after the corn has been harvested, that seed is going from that combine to a trailer to be taken to market or to storage.